So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this weekly Wednesday webinar series. We've broken the hump of the weekend, and we're now the week, should I say? And we're now motoring towards the weekend, and we've got an excellent webinar to help you along on that journey. So today we are diving into the world of securing your Microsoft estate. In particular, we're talking about the E5 suite. And we see the Microsoft Microsoft security is ever present in almost every organization and every customer that we talk to. And each are utilizing, at least in some way, some of the security features that Microsoft provides, whether this is through the license they have or that part of their subscription, or they've extended their licensing to include those capabilities. And so some of those by design, so active decisions, but there are plenty where some was made by decisions out of the CFO's office instead. But E5 can be confusing. So really, what's in it? What does the E5 suite of products and solutions, security solutions, provide? So what can it do as well? What controls does it provide to use in that organization to protect your users' information and infrastructure? There's also a question about what should I use? Out of all of that suite of controls, which one should we be implementing? So really, it's all about maximizing the value of that investment in E5. Can it do it all? Should we be trying to do everything with it or not? But all of that is going to be covered by Sam, who's our resident Microsoft expert. So introducing today's speaker, it's Sam Lambert. Sam's a seasoned Microsoft Cloud security architect. He has a wealth of experience in deploying Microsoft E5 solutions, and understands some of the pitfalls, but also, most importantly, the best practices. And that's all through hands-on experience when it comes to delivering these capabilities, and obviously holds the relevant certifications and is a Microsoft cybersecurity architect expert and Azure security engineer associate. So with that, I will hand over to Sam, and he'll walk us through our E5 licensing webinar. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you for the introduction. So today we're going to be taking a look at how to bolster your security program by maximizing your E5 investment. So I'll begin by trying to nail down this term E5 because it can be somewhat ambiguous, but for the purpose of this webinar, when I refer to E5, I'm discussing the Microsoft 365 E5 license, which is all-encompassing and includes the security and compliance features. However, if you are a Microsoft Enterprise Mobility Security E5 customer, you will still have access to all of these products that you can see on the screen, but you won't have the full set of capabilities within the Microsoft Purview suite. Now, you can also add on standalone licenses. So if any of these products take your fancy, there's still time to add these to your security budget / Christmas list. You just need to bolt on the additional standalone license. So hopefully that's the boring license caveats out the way. And with that, we'll dive into it. So at first, I'd like to talk about attack surface reduction. These rules protect against threats like malicious scripts, executable files, and suspicious activities, which will reduce the attack surface for your Windows endpoint environment. So just to call out there, this is not supported on Mac or Linux. However, I would argue if you are operating in a cross-platform environment, that's not a reason not to deploy ESR rules, because ultimately you're trying to reduce the attack surface wherever possible. And if you're following your zero trust principles, you will be assuming compromise. And in this scenario, in an assumed compromise situation, you want to increase friction for a threat actor as much as possible. So if they're trying to do some kind of malicious activity and you've configured the right ESR rules, hopefully that's building risk signals to your XDR product so that it can either prevent or detect malicious activity. I will also add, though, whilst you want to introduce friction for a threat actor, you don't want to introduce too much friction to the point it hinders your business operations. Now, it's not advisable to do the scream test on ESR rules. For those of you who do not know what the scream test is, that's where you're not really sure what's going to break, if anything, but you decide to disable the service anyways and see who screams. That's quite an effective way to rapidly find out where the problem is, but it's not so user-friendly, and actually it could also cause critical business failures in terms of certain processes. So what's the solution to that? Well, first of all, you want to run with this in audit mode. You want to be quite liberal with the amount of time that you allow this to run in audit mode so that you can get a good natural flow of business processes throughout your environment. And here you'll be able to identify perhaps processes you weren't aware of as a security team. Perhaps there's some shadow IT processes going on, or perhaps it's just some outdated protocols, which are genuine processes, but the business has never really shone a light on them and understood exactly what those are. So using these techniques, we can put it in audit mode. We can also put it in warn mode prior to audit mode, so that it's soft block. In essence, it allows the user to override, and that will allow you to give a little bit more time and breathing space before you actually put it into a fully fledged block mode. You can also use techniques, as we can see on the screen, to make the experience a little bit more palatable for the end user. For example, instead of blocking it outright, you might want to direct them to raise a help desk ticket or raise a support email. And that's a great way to capture your false positives and raise tickets via the service desk formally, so that you could take a step back and look at what exemptions may need to be implemented going forward. And this can also identify pockets within your organization which perhaps need to focus on areas where they need to replace certain processes. For example, rather than blocking outright for everyone, you might create exemptions for, let's say that you do switch this on in block mode without going through this process, you might find you get disgruntled calls from the likes of an accountant saying, I've used this spreadsheet for the last 10 years, but now when I press a button to do my calculations, it's stopped working and I can't do my job. But actually, you're also going to get this from your techies as well, because you can find out they're running processes for support purposes, like running PSExec, or perhaps it's some questionable PowerShell script, which is ran for provisioning purposes, because, quote unquote, we've always done it that way. So this is where you really want to spend the time. And exclusive to E5 is going to be these dashboards that you get access to. So I will also caveat, technically you could deploy this with the AMS free license via group policy and PowerShell, but you won't be able to get access to these dashboards to understand where these false positives or what's happening in audit mode. And you'll be resorted to trawling through event logs, which will be a very painful process. So that's also not advisable. In a nutshell, this is a very powerful tool. It just needs the right planning before you implement it. And now we'll move on to Defender for Identity. So first of all, how we deploy this. This is something that you're going to deploy as an agent onto your domain controllers, but also if you've got ADFS servers, then you can also deploy it on there. As a side note, if you are still running ADFS servers, I would recommend putting on your security map to migrate away from them as well and move on to something like password hash synchronization or password through authentication. Essentially, those are attack surfaces in and of themselves, because they're typically internet-facing servers. Yes, you might have WAFs in front of them, but there's something that threat actors can probe at from the internet. So therefore, it makes sense to migrate to a managed service that Microsoft handles all that authentication for you. And from an engineer's point of view, it's less for them to feed and water from a patch and maintenance stance as well. But I digress. So back to Defender for Identity capabilities, the type of capabilities that it's going to have reconnaissance, so identifying rogue users and attackers doing nefarious activity like sniffing your network using LDAP queries. So for instance, if you've ever had a pen tester in your organization, or hopefully not a genuine threat actor, they will run tools like Bloodhound, which will sniff out your network looking for attack paths within your AD environment. With Defender for Identity, it should be picking all that activity up and sending an alert to your security operations center. It also looks at compromised credentials. So things like brute forcing, it's going to pick that up internally if someone's brute forcing from within your network, as well as activities such as moving laterally within the network. It'll also have capabilities, what we put under the umbrella of domain dominance. So if you've ever heard of golden tickets attacks, you don't want them, because that's going to give your threat actors the keys to the kingdom. And probably that has less mindshare feature, I would say, would be the honey tokens. So Defender for Identity has capabilities where you can deploy honey tokens, Let's say that you might want to create a fictitious file that says password.doc. You could put it on some sensitive server, and that way, if anyone goes poking around in there, it's going to trigger an alert using Defender for Identity. And the good news with all this, if you integrate this with XDR or your Microsoft Sentinel instance, the good news is your SOC is going to light up like a Christmas tree should you detect any of this activity. And now we will change gears to Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. So Defender for Cloud Apps, let's start with its capabilities. So it's a CASB, what's that? A Cloud Access Security Broker. So think of capabilities such as you could integrate this with Atlassian. So if you're using Confluence, for example, you could integrate it so that you could take more granular session control within those third-party cloud applications. So to give an example, you might block downloads on personal devices, whilst you might have a more liberal control when they've logged in on a managed device. Let's say you're using Intune and it's checking for compliance, then it might say, fill your boots, you can download because you're on a company laptop, right? Now, you could also use it for GitHub Enterprise, so detecting mass downloads of your repositories. If your crown jewels might actually be those code repos, and that's another great scenario where you might just want to put in some controls which detects mass downloads, or you might go a step further and put it to automatically disable account after it meets a certain threshold. Now, this is going to be an agentless technology. So if we contrast that with the first slide where we mentioned that Mac and Linux weren't supported as part of ESR rules, well, you don't have that problem with this technology because this control is all going to be within the browser. So if you're logged on Linux or you're logged on, if you're logged on on a Mac, then those controls are going to still be very relevant. It can also act as your SaaS security posture management solution. When might you use that? Well, you might get lots of requests come through the business saying that they want certain applications. Well, you can use this catalog to see what Microsoft rates objectively through their different scores and arrive at a risk score. And you might be able to make a more informed decision whether to sanction the application or not. So for example, you might have a policy in place which you want all your third-party cloud applications to be integrated with your single sign-on provider because you want to centralize that control and all of that good stuff. Well, you could use this to look up, well, does it support SAML? Does it support multi-factor authentication? So you might have requirements which you want to understand if it at least supports our minimum requirements in terms of compensating controls, et cetera, and you can use this as a nice place to do those lookups. But then also you can take governing controls using Defender for Endpoint as well as Defender for Cloud. So if you're Defender for Endpoint, if you're a Defender for Endpoint user, then you could also use this to intercept applications at a device level as well as via the browser as well. So that's also worth noting. It's an advanced threat protection capability. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we have some dedicated slides as this relates to XDR, but just for a basic example, that all of these risk signals are going to form part of your XDR product and then correlate into one place. Now, it's also going to have app governance capabilities. So you can think of things like detecting unusual app activity based on anomaly detection, or identify suspicious or malicious app attributes, as well as unreputable applications. For example, if it's not been signed by a publisher, or it might just be that a certain application is delegated too much permissions, so it's got excessive permissions. It's excessive permissions in a single app. So for example, if it's requesting apps to someone's mailbox and that application has no relation to mailbox or calendars, then that's probably going to be something warranting a little bit more investigation. Moving on to Microsoft ID protection. So as with always, Microsoft has nuances with their licensing model and with ID protection. Today we're going to talk about the Entra ID P2 features exclusively, but you may have access to partial access to this product via P1. But today we'll focus on the P2 features, which you will get part of your E5 license, whether that be MS365 or EMS. So let's take a little bit of time to look at some of those capabilities. We're just going to take two examples for risky users, and then risky sign-ins. So the type of capabilities within the risky users would be things like password spray attacks. So we mentioned brute forces previously with a Defender for Identity. Well, you really want to take a holistic approach to that capability. So you want to be able to detect that type of malicious activity from a cloud identity perspective. So a typical attack in this scenario might be a password spray attack. And the more sophisticated attackers aren't just going to send 50 requests at once and then 100 more and then 100 more, because that's probably going to lock out your accounts, and that's going to set off detection rule. Instead, they're probably going to take a low and slow approach to this. So they might do one every few hours. It might be one every few days. And in particular, determined, sophisticated threat actors cases, they're going to spend many months trying to crack that nut. Now, obviously, you want to have layers of controls so that if they do get the password, you're going to rely on your other controls like MFA, conditional access, etc., etc. Now, another example might be leaked credentials. So if you're using AD Connect to synchronize your on-premise to your cloud identities, and you're using password hash synchronization capabilities, then that will be able to recognize if it's got a leaked credential. So for example, if it's compromised credentials that's made its way to the dark web or a paste bin of some sort, then you can set detections up so that it's going to let your security team know that these passwords are compromised, or not set the password to begin with. Now, moving on to risky sign-ins, we can look at capabilities like impossible travel, which is just as it sounds. That could detect geographical location logins that are not possible. So for example, if someone was to sign in from Newcastle and then an hour later detects a sign in from North Korea, then that is generally going to be impossible. I say it generally because unless of course you're in one of Elon Musk's SpaceX rockets, then that is technically possible and physically possible, as naturally I looked that up as part of this, and you can do that under 5.3 minutes apparently. But in most cases, that's going to be a threat actor. It'll also look at things like anonymous IP usage. So, for example, that might be things like logging into a Tor browser, for example, or if some VPN that's not very reputable, which is trying to mask the IP address, then you should expect to get those alerts. And then you've got the possibility to put those into block mode so that risky sign-in users can't sign in to begin with. So there's lots of good capabilities within there, but for the purpose of the day, we're going to cover everything at a high level. So we will move on to the next slide. Now, if we start to bring all of these capabilities together, now today we've discussed 4 out of 5 of these. That's because I couldn't neatly fit Defender for Office 365 in an E5 box. But the principles are the same. You've got a single product which is sending its signals to a shared place, which it's able to correlate that. So it's correlating the risk signals between products, which gives you the advantage to cross-product threat hunt, where you might find that more challenging if you're splitting up your security tooling. It's a little bit more difficult from an investigation standpoint to see certain steps within the attack chain. So in this scenario, this tends to be more clear lineage within the attack chain when you centralize or consolidate your security tooling in this way. And another advantage is going to be the integration points. So if you're keeping everything in the Microsoft ecosystem, what you're going to find is that these integration points to the likes of your SIEM, let's say you are using Microsoft Sentinel, you could connect these up in actually a few clicks, because it's just API. It's just an API connection that it's trusted with the vendor using the same using vendor native capabilities. Contrast that to perhaps sending logs, across your internal network to a syslog server or an event forwarder, and so on. It's a nice clean setup and an easy integration point. And this next slide is really just a way to illustrate how the XDR platform could come into play in let's say a typical attack chain. So you might have someone clicking a link, and that goes to that's a phishing link that opens a command and control center. Perhaps that's a Cobalt Strike beacon. And the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that you want to take a defense and depth approach to when you're deploying your security strategy. You don't want to rely on any one control, because you want to assume that one control is going to fail and you have multiple levels of control. And all the while, this will be building risk signals when various activities going on. And because it's converging into one place, which we'll collectively call an XDR, that's going to make it a lot easier for SOC engineers to do them investigations as well. Now we'll move on to Microsoft Purview. And what I found was with Microsoft Purview is it's quite hard to condense that into a single slide, because it's a comprehensive set of solutions. But I'm going to attempt to do a lightning round of Microsoft Purview, where I've broke up 5 of the main components, or 5 components where we probably see the most demand coming from, and that would be broken down into the following. So, and I will also say, when you come to do a Microsoft Purview project, it's best to build this out iteratively rather than trying to do everything at once. So you want to break it down into bite-sized chunks, bite-sized deliverables, and break it into phases. So a typical methodology that we might carve it up to this into crawl, walk, run, and we'll split that out so you can graduate onto the next steps and start using the more richer features as you go, rather than trying to set up a project to do everything all at once. Okay, so what might a typical project look like? Well, you want to begin with the foundation of setting your sensitivity labels. That might be underpinning your existing data classification policy. So you've got your directive controls saying this is what users should be doing. They should be labeling the documents. We all know that when we rely on manual processes, that's often doomed to fail. So when Purview comes in, is that it will allow you to underpin those directive controls with a technical control. So we can start to automate or enforce labeling through ensuring that they're being set by default. And then we also want to use techniques like auto labeling, where we'll use sensitive information types, which are essentially ways of Microsoft being able to recognize patterns within files, documents, Teams, chat, you name it, and then auto classify or auto add a DLP rule on. So to give a basic example, if you've got an account number and it's in close proximity to a social security number, which would match a regex pattern, then you might have a high level of confidence that this is PII. And you can classify that as such. We can set it to low, medium, or high confidence. And based on that level of confidence, we might take different governance rules depending on that. And we can also be very granular on the policy for certain types of sensitive information types, so that we can be nimble with our DLP rules. We'll also look at strategies like putting it in audit mode or simulation mode first. So you essentially set these sensitive information types up, let it run for 2 weeks, take a step back, see what it's detecting as part of those pattern matches, and then you can evaluate if it's accurate, if it's not, and where you need to make changes. And we would also recommend deploying this to pilot groups first, having a diverse range of departments within your pilot group, so that you can get a good feel of the flow of information. Then you might look at something like Defender for Cloud Apps. So if you are an E5 customer, you will be eligible to use these features, and you can use Purview DLP features in conjunction with Defender for Cloud Apps, as you can Defender for Endpoint. So in the case of Defender for Endpoint, you can block, you could block moving data to a USB as an example. That's another capability that you will be eligible to use. And next, not necessarily next, but if you may have scenarios where you've got file shares, such as network shares, what you've not quite migrated everything over to 365, but you want to apply the same set of capabilities to 365. So therefore, you would use the network, you would use the scanner. You can do a continuous scan pointed at it, and so it's continuously doing the scan, and that'll support stuff like NAS storage as well as SQL servers. Your old school on-premise SharePoint server, if you're still running that. But if you are, just know that I think that's becoming end of life in 2026. So again, you want to probably have that on the roadmap to migrate. And then lastly, you might start looking at how do you centralize this into one platform for a data catalog. So this is probably particularly relevant if you're in a multi-cloud environment, but not necessarily. But if you're using AWS or Google Cloud Platform, you can bring it all together by labeling things outside in multi-cloud platforms. So you might have S3 buckets that you want to layer this technology over, as well as PaaS services in Azure, such as Azure SQL or Cosmos DBs. And this will allow you to label them, set data catalogs. You can define data owners, data stewards. You can look up data, all of that good stuff. Brings it all together and have a nice centralized place across platforms. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I will leave it at that and bring Rich back into this.
Thank you very much, Sam. There's clearly a lot of capability inside the E5 suite, and I'd say a lot more capability and features to really go into, that we could fit into a single webinar to deep dive on those. And I probably should have, I'll probably get my hand slapped by the marketing team at the very start of the webinar. I probably should just remind everybody that there is a Q&A function as part of this webinar platform. And I see some of you have found it already, but would very much invite you all to add any questions that you have for Sam within there. So without ado, I'll start to just tackle some of the questions that we've been asked. First one here is for ASR, Sam, and question is, how granular can you be with the exceptions? And when in audit mode, can you use the alerts to tune the policies? I know that you touched upon audit mode when you walked through that at the sort of start of the webinar. So how easy is it, I guess, to be able to tune and get it to a point where you can get it into blocking?
Yeah. So in terms of the granularity, in terms of exceptions, it can be very granular. You could apply these to your using your existing Microsoft 365 groups. You could use Azure security groups. So this works well if you've already got a nice bucket for departments, or better yet, if you're using dynamic rules. If you've really got a handle on your identity and access management capabilities, you might already have these feeding through so that you've got dynamic rules for certain business functions, and that way you can apply those rules at group level, which would apply at the function. In terms of getting to a point of actually getting it in block mode, I would say you take a progressive approach. So you might start with audit mode, evaluate it, see where your false positives lie, and then then you might graduate onto warn mode, so that you're not going to cause too much business disruption to business activity, because it allows the user to override. At the same time, check those overrides from a security point of view and see, what is valid, what's not. And then as a last stage, put it in block mode, because we're quite comfortable with what our baseline is.
Excellent. Thank you, Sam. I say thank you, Sam. I'm going to put it on the spot because there are quite a few more questions coming into the Q&A function. We have one from Salim here. And actually, this is a great question. Is Sentinel part of the E5 license? And actually, to be honest, I'll probably add to that to Salim's question there, and really ask, is it part of the license, but also does it add to the value? And what would that be the recommended path to go?
Yeah, so it's not part of the E5 license. Sentinel sits within Microsoft Azure, so you're essentially going to pay for what you consume inside that. So the typical setup would be you provision what's called a log analytic workspace, and the aim of the game is to get all of your logs into that log analytic workspace, and then Sentinel layers over the top of that, and that's where you would put in all of the capabilities like your threat detection rules, etc. So the answer is it's not included as E5. But you can integrate it with Sentinel at a very low cost. If you were going to use Sentinel and your Microsoft 365 stack, for instance, it would be a very low cost in terms of log consumption, because in Seam world, those logs are pennies. And actually, I think Microsoft give you so much free for at least for the first 3 months in E5.
Brilliant. And so, would you say that'd be the advice that if it is that low cost, then why wouldn't you put everything into there? And I suppose you could then be selective about what additional logs that you need as you I suppose expand that.
Yeah, for me, if you're not using a SIEM, it's a no-brainer to you want to use something that's native to Microsoft, because as I mentioned, them integration points, they really are a couple of clicks. Now, I will also add caveat from a managed service provider, it's not as easy because where we've got tuning and all the rest of it, but from a connection, from an integration point standpoint, it really is very easy to connect it up, and it's going to be low cost in terms of log consumption. It's probably a great first step if you're just taking the journey onto being a SIEM partner customer.
Thank you. So just another question here, which is regarding Microsoft Entra ID protection. Will it not block a lot of false positives for impossible travel, e.g. the use of genuine VPNs? And I suppose actually there's that probably applies to multiple products. I think there's sort of impossible travel within Defender for identity, Microsoft Cloud App Security. I suppose that is a very valid question. I know that if I'm traveling, my mobile data routes me back to the UK generally, so I can look like I'm in two places at once. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is referring to the Microsoft ID protection capability, where you can block risky users from, so for example, or risky sign-ins, I should say, to be more accurate. So if you were to sign in and all of a sudden your IP address is completely different to what it normally is, and it's at a different geographical location, that could be for VPNs. I've also seen it with, just 5G satellite. It just happens that the ISP is in London and you're somewhere else in the country. So what I would say with that is, again, it just takes careful planning when you're deploying these solutions. My recommendation would be to begin with having more liberal controls. So you might begin with setting it to, instead of blocking, but make the user put in an MFA. So that way, if it was compromised, you've got another layer of control, so that they've got the password, but then it's going to enforce that MFA token, so that they're prompted to do it. And then once you've got an idea of your baseline, you can also start classifying them as false positives. And when you do this inside Microsoft, you're actually feeding the machine learning. So as you go, you can feed it these false positives, and it will start to understand what your actual baseline looks like, and what you'll find that over time as your false positive rate will be reduced.
Excellent. You mentioned think about using MFA for those. I'd actually go one step further and say that if you're not using MFA, go and address that security control full stop before doing anything else, because that's critically important. Anything cloud-based, online, or even internally now. So just we've got two or three more questions here, and I think we've got some time to go through those. On one of the slides, it said not supported on Mac or Linux. Which modules does this apply to? We have a mixed environment. Should we look outside of Microsoft? What do you suggest?
Yeah, so that was specifically for ASR rules. So I would say it's not a reason not to deploy the ASR rules, but then if you've got other capabilities, let's take a step back actually. So if you can still use Defender for endpoint to be deployed on those operating systems, but the ASR rule specifically is not going to have that capability. So I guess it's a case of evaluating that environment. If you've got a large Linux or large Mac environment, let's say that it's tipped the other way and you're 80-20, then yes, you probably want to start looking at what compensating controls can I add. And what I would be doing is doing a capabilities matrix, and I would have them lined up to say, okay, well, our Macs are actually missing this component, therefore they're exposed. And that's where you might need to start considering additional toolings to bolt on top if Defender for Endpoint's not going to provide the level of capability for your risk appetite.
Brilliant. So another question here is on Purview. You had a sort of great slide walking through. So how long do you find it takes to implement Purview? There was quite a few steps on your slide.
Yes, so they can be large projects. It really does depend on the complexity of your environment and how much you actually want to implement. So the slide had 5 different components. Actually, that was a non-exhaustive list. There is even more. So it's really comprehensive in terms of capabilities. What I suggest is you start small. So I would just start with components 1 and 2. If you're new to Purview, I'd just get those sensitivity labels out there. Let's say at a very minimum, get the sensitivity labels out there, because that way you're educating your users to be labeling, even if that's not going to take any governance action. And then you could start to build your security roadmap to say, now we're going to start switching on DLP rules. We're going to start restricting sharing from external for certain sensitive information types, and so on and so on. So I would say it's impossible to see how long a Purview implementation takes, because there's too many variables. So, but what I would say is we offer workshops where we can work with you to do a data security apportionment evaluation, see where you are, where your gaps are, and where it's going to make more sense to prioritize implementations for your business.
Yeah, actually, that links very well with the the last question in the Q&A form. And actually, if there are any more questions, please let us know. And that is, would it be possible to have a lower level, deeper dive version of this session, or better one-to-one session? Now, obviously, there is more, and we could probably do a single one per control, and that's probably some good feedback of things that we could probably touch upon, and a deeper dive in each one in future weekly Wednesday webinar sessions. But in the meantime, I think we will close it there unless there's any more questions. But if you do want to know more and get more out of the E5 suite of products, then please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Sam, or your account manager. Our team will be sending a follow-up email with details on how to replay the session if you want to dive into some items, but also gives you the opportunity to reach out and get a one-on-one with Sam. Brilliant. So if there's no further questions, we will close out the webinar there. I thank you all for giving us some of your time on this Wednesday afternoon, and thank you very much. And thank you very much, Sam.
Thanks.